Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. A little bit of Zoom etiquette before we start. Please keep your audio muted and your video switched off to prevent any interruptions. And we are also streaming this live on Facebook, so you can use that option if you wish. And this session will also be recorded and available on YouTube and Facebook if you want to view it later. And if you are posting this on Instagram and Facebook or any other social media like Twitter, please hashtag Environmental Foundation Limited. And we will also be taking some questions as well. So you can send this towards the end of the session after the main speaker session. And we will screen a few, and due to time restrictions, we will not be able to answer all the questions. We will select a few prioritized key questions for the speakers. So let's begin. Welcome to this edition of Green Conversations, and where we are going to talk about a few of the themes that are highly relevant and timely. So it's becoming more and more evident that these pandemics caused by zoonotic diseases like COVID-19 emerged due to a range of factors, and this includes how we treat our environment and how we manage our natural resources. So because of this, we have brought together a panel of speakers from various fields so that we can have an interdisciplinary discussion on how these zoonotic diseases link to environmental factors, and also to talk about where we are now and where we can go from here. So today's panelists are extremely distinguished, eminent speakers, and if I were to give a full description of their credentials and achievements, it will take me a very long time. So we are going to give a short introduction to them, and then we'll kick off our discussion. So our keynote speaker today is Professor Malik Piris, who really should not be needing any introduction, because if you have heard of SARS, and I'm sure everyone has heard of SARS, you should have heard of him because it's him and the team led by him that discovered and isolated the virus back in 2003. He is currently a research professor at the University of Hong Kong and is also in the advisory committee of the World Health Organization, the WHO. And then we have Dr. Eric Wickramayaika, who's a leading conservation scientist that has many years of experience working in landscape ecology. He's not only the chairperson of the Environmental Foundation Limited, but he's also the director of the Wetlands and Wildlife Unit at the World Wildlife Fund in Hong Kong. Then we have Ms. Manori Gunawardana, who's also a leading wildlife biologist who's working at the Born Free Foundation, and she's also a director at the EFL, and she has years of experience in working towards combating illegal wildlife trade, and is also in the sphere of species conservation. And then we have Dr. Sumit Pilpitia, who really requires no introduction at all. He worked at the World Bank as a lead environmental specialist for the longest time, and also acted as the Director General of the Department of Wildlife Conservation, the DWC, for a short period of time. He's a very prominent figure in Sri Lanka, especially when it comes to elephant conservation. And last but not least, we have Mr. Jean-Marc Champagne from the World Wildlife Fund in Hong Kong. He's the head of finance there, and he started his career off as an investment banker and now has many years of experience advising investors on how to shift financial flows towards sustainable investments. So let's kick off our discussion with Professor Malik Piris. Professor Piris, to start off the discussion, can you give us a little bit of an overview of what are zoonotic diseases and the historical patterns of these?
Good morning to everyone, and my congratulations to all of you for organizing this quite timely webinar. So the question was, what are zoonotic diseases? So zoonotic diseases, by definition, are infections that go from animals to humans. So as examples, rabies is a classic example. Leptospirosis is another one that is familiar to many people in Sri Lanka. But you have to also keep in mind that these infections also go in the other direction. It can go from humans back to animals. I mean, COVID-19 is an example. You've probably heard about infections in a zoo in New York, I think, where infection affected some large felid species, tigers, etc. Now, overall, the scale of the problem is quite huge. There are about 1 billion cases of zoonotic infections every year worldwide, with millions of deaths. But I think we have to also distinguish between the more routine zoonotic infections and those that are what are called emerging infectious diseases. So emerging infectious diseases also are mainly zoonotic in origin, but the big difference are that they are new and unexpected events. And because of that, the impact that they pose is quite huge. I mean, examples being SARS or Ebola, or of course, right now, COVID-19. Over.
And moving to, thank you, Professor Pires. That was a very good overview and a good start for this discussion. So moving back to environment, because we are trying to build this narrative around how zoonotic diseases and environmental factors actually relate. Human activities actually, the way we interact with nature and the way our activities kind of result in environmental disturbances, that also kind of act as a catalyst for these infectious diseases. So next to Dr. Eric Vikramanayaka, how do habitat destruction and deforestation result in spread of these infectious organisms?
Thank you, Jadu. I hope everyone can hear me, and thank you for joining us today. So, I mean, there are many studies that have now associated habitat destruction, that is degradation and loss and fragmentation, with the spread of emerging infectious diseases such as Ebola and West Nile virus and SARS. And most of it happens because of the increased contact between wildlife and people as habitat as people move into these wild areas and convert the forest. And of course, don't forget that there are also other diseases that are not zoonotic, like malaria and dengue or rat fever, that are not necessarily, as I said, zoonotics, but are spread by animal vectors, not just as serious. So basically, when habitats are degraded, it tends to favor many of these disease vectors or the host species that are also more tolerant of habitat degradation. And I'm speaking of species like rodents and bats and many of the insects like mosquitoes that are more commensal with humans. So habitat degradation and urbanization, which is about occupancy by people, can result in this closer contact between the high-risk wildlife species, high risk in terms of carrying diseases, and humans, increasing the risk of spillover and disease outbreaks. There was a recent study that just came out a few weeks ago from Stanford University that actually predicts that zoonotic diseases will become more common as people continue to convert natural habitats into other anthropogenic land uses and brings people and wildlife into greater contact. So we need to be vigilant. But the question is, I mean, how is this relevant to Sri Lanka? So if you look at the wildlife of Sri Lanka, it includes many of these high-risk wildlife species that have caused the zoonotic, zoonotic outbreaks, such as, we are talking about horseshoe bats and pangolins, and even some of the primates like macaques. And these species have been implicated in zoonotics. Fortunately, we have been spared any of the serious epidemics that have happened in other parts of the world. And this is despite the fact that Sri Lanka's forests have been extensively cleared and fragmented and degraded. So maybe we have been just lucky till now, and maybe it's only a matter of time before we have an epidemic outbreak. And we have actually had these outbreaks of some diseases, as Professor Pires mentioned, things like leptospirosis, for instance. We had an outbreak in 2008, which resulted in over 7,000 cases reported with about a 10% fatality rate. And apparently Sri Lanka has the second highest reported incidences of leptospirosis worldwide on a per capita basis. There has been some research in Sri Lanka that have found that leptospirosis emerged from contact with some of the host species such as rats and bandicoots and squirrels and mongooses, which are all species that are commonly found in degraded habitats in Sri Lanka, and even even transferred to domestic cattle and buffaloes. And these researchers, in fact, pointed out that these outbreaks can be attributed to the rapid unplanned urbanization that has brought wild and domesticated animals and people into close contact, and also the proliferation of rodent populations in human population centers. So loss of natural habitats is not just a conservation issue, but it's also a health issue. And since it's an important driver of zoonotic virus transmission. Over.
Thanks, Dr. Eric. Completely agree. And it's because these pandemics like COVID-19 are brought by activities, as you said, that bring animals and humans and wildlife in close contact. And one of the reasons, as you mentioned, is that encroachment on natural habitats or wildlife areas. And that's one way. And the other way is through unregulated wildlife trading. So Manori, coming to you, let's talk a little bit about how illegal or unregulated wildlife trading also help spreading of these diseases, and with a special link to exotic wildlife trading.
Thanks, Chatu. I'm trying to share a screen. If it doesn't work, I'll just to show you a few slides. And just to looking at the word, let's use the word exotic. We tend to look towards exotic species. So we look at things like tigers, we think of ivory, we think of these things happening in very far-flung places, for example. We also seem to have or put cultural labels on them. So we think, it's not us. It could be some cultural affinity, some traditional affinity. We think these are marginalized communities that are consuming wildlife. So, I mean, what I want to make very clear is it's not necessarily exotic. So wildlife markets exist here in Sri Lanka, bushmeat being the main one. And as you know, it's not a very sanitary process where wild animals are caught, butchered, and sold. It is not subsistence consumption. It never is. It's one level above or more. This is a bag of venison. It looks like meat you would buy in Food City, but it's not. On top, you would see these little tags of skin. What they do is that they prove the authenticity of the meat by showing those samples. So it's clearly meant for trade. It's not just someone in a village sharing their catch with someone. So in terms of wildlife trafficking and bushmeat trade in particular in Sri Lanka, there is some growing concern for it because it is actually going from the source areas to markets that are far away, even Colombo. Thanks, Chatu.
Thanks, Manori. That was very interesting to hear. And moving on to, because we want to talk about like how we can move forward, and of course with that comes sustainable development. And in a rush to reset our economy, it's very likely that most of the countries will amp up their industrial activities, right? And it's not going to be any different in Sri Lanka. And we have a lot of case studies where we have gone into haphazard development projects and they fail. So with economic activity or economic development, it always comes a cost, and it's always at the expense of, and usually at the expense of environmental integrity. I think you will agree with that. So Dr. Sumit Pilipiti, I just want to ask you specifically, since you've worked at the World Bank, As a developing country, can Sri Lanka balance both conservation and development? And related to that, whether the environmental impact assessment, the EIA procedure that we have in place, whether that's sufficient to ensure that the environmental damage is minimal?
Well, when it comes to most developing countries, conserving nature and facilitating infrastructure development is certainly a challenge. But it's not a question of whether we can do it. We must do it for the survival of the country, because biodiversity and ecosystem services are a must for development. Unfortunately, Sri Lanka has not done a very good job of balancing this in the past. And why is that? It's largely because of poor planning, because planning is done in Sri Lanka in isolation, in an environment of fragmented institutional responsibilities, because plethora of ministries are set up for political reasons, and therefore sectors are broken into, fragmented into different areas. So it becomes quite difficult to do planning in that type of situation. Now, the environmental impact assessment process is supposed to address this. However, in my opinion, and based on some studies that have been done by the World Bank as well as others, I think the EIA process is inadequate to address this, because the EIA looks largely at a project in isolation, and the focus on looking at cumulative impacts on a landscape, on a landscape level, is not very well done. So also, some of the biggest projects that have an impact on the natural ecosystem in Sri Lanka are public sector finance projects. And the EIA process, in my opinion, is largely a rubber stamping of the large government development projects. It's much more robust when it comes to a private sector project. So how can we change this? Because we need to conserve nature and facilitate development. We have to remember that Sri Lanka is a small country with a high population density, and it's a biodiversity hotspot, which means proper planning is essential. There is no question about it. But to do that, we have to start from things that is very simply, can be addressed by the government by instituting a proper institutional arrangements at the ministerial level. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, I feel that all agencies with an environmental mandate or a conservation mandate should be put in one ministry, and that ministry's mandate should be only conservation, rather than having a development mandate in that ministry. Like at the current point, we have environment, wildlife, land and land development under one particular ministry. When you have that, you have conflicting interests. Right now, we are having a problem of the elephant movement path between Kalawava and Kahallapallakale, where actually one of the few corridors that are being used in this country. The minister who is in charge of lands, who is also the environment and wildlife minister, is distributing land in the corridor, blocking the corridor. If that happens, HEC is going to increase. So this type of institutional arrangements where there are conflicting mandates is a bit of a problem. Getting back to what we can do, strategic environmental assessments will enable us to plan development on a landscape basis in a way that we can have minimal damage to ecosystems. So that, I think, is a very important thing, and we have to start moving that way, and that should be a mandatory requirement, in my opinion. This will overcome some of the main shortcomings of the EIA process. And land use planning in this landscape should be based on the strategic environmental assessment. Public or private sector development projects should be required to conform to these land use guidelines in these specific landscapes. I think if we do this, I think we can succeed in facilitating development and conserving nature.
Thank you, Dr. Pilapitia, for that detailed answer. I think there are lots of organizations working in silo, and that coordination is also very difficult. So looking at the global economy, Jean-Marc, can we think about how going forward the public and the private sector, how can they focus on the post-COVID recovery plans? What should they be focusing on when they're formulating these plans?
Yeah, thank you, Shadu. Just to talk about, I'll give this from a Hong Kong perspective, and how it, you can take from this how it could relate to Sri Lanka. So, I mean, essentially, governments around the world are already providing urgent support to address the health crisis itself. There's been numerous type of rescue measures that have been out there, and a lot of those have been set up to and will be required to mitigate the reduction of household income and avoid bankruptcies of SMEs due to sudden collapses in the economy. Now things are picking up a bit, but these issues still remain. But beyond the measures that the standard typical stimulus type measures for that you'll have out of a central bank to stimulate an economy. Things that have to be involved in relaunching are crucial decisions that need to be made beyond this. So if you're looking at where financial flows need to be directed, we here in Hong Kong have called on the government to demonstrate leadership and foresight by continuing and reinforcing the trajectory towards a resilient and sustainable economy. So this is absolutely essential to use this as an opportunity to almost, if you want to say, reset the economy, or at least try to reset the economy in terms of where it's going. So I think this is the time to bounce forward and accelerate a shift towards an economy which is climate neutral, protects and restores our natural world, and and hopefully lets nothing go to waste. So that's what we're, those are some of the things that we're talking about. But from the start, the public money must be invested in a transparent and viable and sustainable way. Business as usual is no longer an option, because as we know and what we're seeing all around the world, we can't continue to go this way, or the way that we have been going. It's just not going to work. We're running out of time. Everything is collapsing, it seems, if you look around. So you have to have economy-wide untargeted measures that would risk or would put on life support obsolete and polluting industries. We need these things to go away. So we need money to be shifting into business models towards sustainability and ensuring a much higher return on public investment. For large companies in particular, the public support should be conditional on full alignment with the Paris Agreement and substantial greening of capital expenditure plans, both within and outside of Hong Kong. So channeling stimulus investments in such a way will create long-lasting jobs, bring about clean sector jobs, and helping, for example, the Hong Kong economy recover. And this also, again, applies to many other economies, but this is just from our context. But more concretely, just to be a little bit more specific here, we are recommending that one, you make a distribution of stimulus funds and bailouts conditional on consistency with the 1.5 degrees Celsius target with the Paris Agreement. Secondly, also accelerate sustainable finance policies to shift financial flows from brown to green, and to direct at least 50% of recovery plans into environmentally sustainable activities. Fourth, do not support environmentally harmful activities. And point 5, to limit future health crises by taking strict action to reduce Hong Kong's role as a key hub of the global illegal wildlife trade. And lastly, limit the health crisis by acting globally against climate change and biodiversity loss. There's a lot of specifics that we go into and what we recommend, but these are just to highlight what we've done and what we're recommending. And I think, again, all of this really applies to any national or government that we're talking about. So those are just some of the things, and happy to discuss more if there's any other questions on that. Back over to you, Shatu.
Thanks, James. Yeah, I think this is the time we take a step back and actually look at what we are spending our finances on, and to fix some of the flaws that we have in the system, as you said, going from brown to green. And we will talk a little bit more later on about how that could feed the benefits back to us. So let's go back to the situation in hand, COVID-19. So Professor Pires, if you can tell us a little bit about what are the trends that we have observed over time with zoonotic diseases? Are they increasing? Are they decreasing? Or whether can we attribute them to any environmental changes? Over to you, Professor Pires.
Yeah, so if you look historically at infectious diseases as a problem, over the 19th and 20th centuries, we had huge advances. We had understanding of how they originate, antibiotics, vaccines to control them. But it is, and indeed, there was a sort of a sense of complacency that this whole problem had been now conquered, so to speak. Although there were people such as the French philosopher and environmentalist René Dubos, who said notably that nature always strikes back. And indeed, we can see that, not just in terms of infectious disease, but I'm sure going forward in terms of climate change and other issues. So over the last 30, 40 years, we have seen an increase in these completely new infections, what we call emerging infectious diseases, which largely come from zoonotic jumps from animals to humans. And there are multiple reasons for this increase. One we have touched upon, that's kind of ecological and environmental factors. So the bushmeat trade again was mentioned, and HIV and Ebola both come from bushmeat trade, where viruses in primates cross to humans. And I don't have to explain how great an impact, for example, HIV has, or for example, Ebola had in the 2014, 2015, and even now ongoing outbreaks. Then there is the trade in wild animals and pet animals. So again, that was touched upon, but the trade in wild game animals for human consumption was the reason for the emergence of SARS and COVID-19. In addition to that, I mean, there's a huge billions of animals traded globally from one part of the world to another for the pet trade. And there are many examples of how that gives rise to disease outbreaks. So classically, there was an outbreak of a disease called monkeypox in the United States about 15 years ago, I think. This is a disease that is not found anywhere in the Americas. It comes from Africa, and it was traced to a consignment of exotic rodent species that were shipped from Africa to the US and mixed with other pet species, and that led to that outbreak. So in addition to that, of course, there are other human things, human factors. International travel is hugely increasing year by year, which means that any outbreak that starts anywhere can be a threat everywhere within a few weeks, as again, we see in the case of COVID-19. Animal husbandry, the way that we raise our livestock, now clearly this is important to feed the increased global population, but this, I mean, the changes that have taken place over the last maybe 50 years, where the scale of animal husbandry has been dramatically increased, centralized, and again, there's production in one place, movement of thousands of animals across thousands of miles for sale and trade. These all allow for the emergence and spread of zoonotic infectious diseases. For example, avian flu being an example. So I think a lot of the things that we are doing, human activities, either in terms of impinging on the environment or in our behavior, are really providing the opportunities for these new infections to jump to humans. And you can see the consequences of this in terms of COVID-19. And I think I completely agree with the comments made by John Mark that we cannot go back to status quo. We cannot just go back to the normal way of doing things, although I fear that the pressures, economic and political pressures, will be very heavy for us to, as soon as whenever this particular outbreak can be contained in some way, that we go back with even greater speed to go back to status quo. And I think this is an opportunity which we all have to grab to really change how we look at things and how we reformat our economies. Over.
Thank you, Professor Pieris. That was extremely interesting. And I think we all have to agree that it's just anthropogenic or human activities that have resulted in a problem of this scale. And going back to, as you say, we've created so many changes over time, especially with the way we trade meat, or like even with the wildlife trafficking and the land use changes. I think it's mostly, there's a big focus on increasing agriculture, and in the same way that currently, as of now, 70% of the Earth's surface, I think, has been modified. So in addition to these zoonotic diseases, there are also other impacts of these land use modifications. And I think maybe Dr. Vikramanayake can talk a little bit about the long-term impacts of land use changes. And even within local context, we have so many sensitive habitats, and to talk a little bit about whether they are adequately protected and given the conservation that's due.
Thank you, Chatu. So, I mean, there are several studies now that have very clearly shown a correlation between land use change for agriculture and for food production, and how they account for almost half of the global zoonotic emerging infectious diseases. And there's a strong relationship, for instance, with exposure to diseases such as malaria and typhus, along with, as a consequence of land use change. And conversion of forests to monocultures such as oil palm and rubber plantations and rice paddies tend to favor disease-carrying hosts. So if land use change continues, especially in Sri Lanka, where forests are converted without much planning, we can certainly expect to see an increase in disease outbreaks. So, as part of the whole the conversation and the effort to reset as we go to a post-COVID world, what we need to do now is transition to a more efficient agriculture approach and methodology. We need to adopt more efficient technologies that maximize productivity in a given area of land. I mean, let's face it, our agricultural practices are centuries old. They have not evolved to keep pace with other environmental or social and even market-based systems, and even with climate change, and they're now maladapted and inefficient. So instead of clearing more forests and converting more natural ecosystems into disease-supporting land uses and landscapes, what we now have to do is focus on making better use of the agricultural lands that we have and make them more productive. The technologies and the techniques are there, and the government should be now focusing on bringing these technologies and introducing them to the farmers, instead of, for instance, waiving fertilizer subsidies, which are actually making the soils less productive and are actually political bribes. We should also be focused on protecting the remaining forests, because they are the reservoirs of biodiversity and the buffers that hold back the emerging infectious diseases and prevent their spread. And these are also, don't forget, these are also the ecosystems that protect our watersheds and provide sustainable water supplies and clean air and healthy environments to support the health of the people, and they provide climate resilience. So yeah, I mean, I think we need to, as part of the whole reset, we need to think about how we can protect our remaining habitats. And some of them are, for instance, are withdrawn rainforests. There's probably less than 10% left, probably even about as low as 5% remaining in any significantly large patches. And these forests are under assault. But it's these forests that protect our watersheds and assure us of a sustainable water supply. The wetlands are not protected. Many are being treated as dumps of garbage and waste, especially in urban and peri-urban areas, and this increases the threats from disease outbreaks. So we have to do a better job at protecting what we have going forward, and then trying to make better use of the land that's already been converted for production. Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks, Dr. Vikram Nayak. That was very insightful. And moving on to trading of animals and wildlife, and also about protecting the environment, there are many regulatory frameworks that are existing to take care of this. For example, there's the CITES, the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna, that looks at regulating some of these illegally traded wildlife. And then you'll have the Convention on Biological Diversity, which looks at protecting ecosystems and species. And then you'll probably have frameworks under the World Health Organization that also looks at preventing the spread of zoonotic emergence and spread of zoonotic diseases. So, but these health issues have raised because of the interactions between humans and environment. So shouldn't these multilateral treaties work in synergy if we are to prevent environmental destruction and also find solutions to these newly emerging infectious diseases? If that makes sense, Manori, that's for you. I know it's a pretty complicated question and probably doesn't have a very short answer either. I tried to phrase it the best way I could.
Okay. So let me just unpack it a bit and say that zoonotic diseases don't differentiate between legal and illegal trade or wildlife. Also, just to look at domestic legislation, Sri Lanka has some very strong conservation legislation in terms of consumption and the consumption of wildlife, which is the FFPO, the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance. I'm sure most of you have heard of it, at least. Let me read the long title to it because it's quite interesting. It's an ordinance to provide for the protection and conservation of fauna and flora in Sri Lanka, their habitats, for the prevention of commercial and other misuse of fauna and flora and their habitats. Sri Lanka has some very good, solid legislation in terms of curbing wildlife trafficking and trade in country. It's again going back to the issues that Dr. Pilapite raised and Dr. Vikram Nayak raised. It's really in the enforcement of it, but also in terms of awareness. Now, going on to CITES, which is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, it's kind of very limited in its remit in that it's looking at the species that are only CITES listed. While a lot of people think that CITES blanket regulates wildlife trade globally, it does not. And also, if you take in the health aspects and the zoonosis aspects of it, CITES in itself has no human or animal health or sort of a welfare remit, so to speak. So health risks particularly are not part of the CITES mandate. So this is something perhaps the parties, which are the countries that are signatory to CITES, could consider. Having said that, CITES does have a working arrangement with what is the OIE, which is the World Body for Animal Health. And there is a component on that. They do have a very strong link with CBD, the Convention on Biodiversity. Therefore, there is nothing precluding any of these multilateral environment agreements finding cross synergies. I think that is the way forward, and I think it's up to the signatories of all these conventions. Sri Lanka is a signatory to all of them, that we start pushing for changes in regard to addressing this current health crisis, which is just global. This is the first time I think it's occurred at this scale with these conventions in place. So I think it's time that these conventions also start adopting. Thanks, Chatu.
Great answer. Thank you, Manori. And then moving on to Dr. Filipitia. Actually, so one of the ways to ensure that our critical habitats and species are protected is by having a dedicated protected area network, and which we do. So my question to Dr. Filipitia is whether the mandated agency, the DWC, has the capacity to actually reduce the stresses on wildlife and these habitats in a post-COVID world, and especially in relation to protecting the areas and not just the protected area, but also the buffer zones and regulating poaching.
Let me first start with the capacity issue, because particularly in the last couple of weeks, the wildlife department has been criticized quite badly for their lack of capacity. Let me try to clarify certain problems that the wildlife department also has, so I might get a little detail here, but that is necessary for you to understand the complications or the complex issues that they are facing. Now, 14% of the land area in Sri Lanka is under the jurisdiction of the wildlife department as designated protected areas, and the DWC is responsible for its protection, conservation, and management. In addition to that, there is 44% of the land area of Sri Lanka that is outside the protected area network, outside this 14%, where elephants tend to share the landscape with humans. And the DWC is called upon to manage the conflict, and these are the areas where the human-elephant conflict is, to manage the conflict in these areas. So basically, the DWC's presence in some form or the other is needed in 58% of the land area of Sri Lanka, to manage protected areas and to try to address HEC. And they have a total of 2,300 staff, that is from the Director General down to the laborer, right? So it's quite obvious that when you consider the task that has been assigned to them or expected of them, the human resource capacity is completely inadequate. But the department has serious problems trying to get approval for additional staff. Getting cadre approval in the government system is a very complicated thing, but the department already has 500 approved cadre vacancies that cannot be filled because the treasury is not allocating money for salaries. And this has been going on for the last 6 years, where they've been trying to get this filled. They have requested the staff to be increased to be a total of 3,500, but they have not got approval. And physical resources are similarly in short supply. So I feel when we are criticizing the DWC, and I am not trying to cover for them, the DWC needs criticism, but we have to realize that they are working under tremendous constraints. So what could they do? Okay, one thing is to keep complaining that we don't have enough resources. Without doing that, couldn't they use their limited resources better? I believe they can. If more rational deployment of the existing staff and resources to areas which are hotspots, that you need the presence of wildlife staff, like areas where there is a heavy amount of poaching or heavy amount of high amount of human-elephant conflict, would make a significant improvement. However, there are external reasons that prevents the DWC of coming up with a very rational deployment of staff. Capacity building in the department is badly needed. Earlier, the National Wildlife Research and Training Center in Giritale had an arrangement with the Wildlife Institute of India. And for the last 20-25 years, they have broken that connection. And I think it's high time they started with it again. Then addressing the other aspects of your question, the focus of DWC should change from tourism to protection and conservation of protected areas. Right now, the Wildlife Conservation Department focuses only on tourism. And in my view, tourism should be a byproduct of conservation, not, even if the country wants to focus on tourism, if conservation is not done on the long term, you cannot have tourism. So they have to actively work towards conservation. In my opinion, I don't think that is happening. I think conservation happens in Sri Lanka largely by default, not by design. Poaching is a significant problem, as Manori mentioned. When there is a shortage of staff, like I mentioned, the department can take alternative options to try to get assistance from outside. Now, for example, there have been a lot of people who are suggesting that the military should be used. There are advantages and disadvantages to that. Rather than using the military directly so that they come and do their own thing, I would prefer to go with the Kenya Wildlife Service model that Richard Leakey introduced in the 1980s when he became the director of KWS for the first time. He got the military to deploy a couple of battalions to the Kenya Wildlife Service with their commanding officer, who was answerable to the director of the Kenya Wildlife Service while also being answerable to the military. I think that is a better way to try to get external support for patrolling and anti-poaching operations. Then we have to try to reduce the market for bushmeat, as Manori very clearly mentioned. But I think the COVID crisis has created an opportunity for us in creating awareness to make the link between zoonotic diseases and bushmeat, so that hopefully people will be a little more nervous to go for bushmeat than they have been. When we are looking at protected area management, we should be focusing a lot on conservation measures, and there should be transparent conservation outcomes that the wildlife department is trying to aim for. If that happens, then they are accountable, which is not in place in the government system also right now. But that type of change needs to take place. A quick word on the buffer zones. The development activities in the buffer zones certainly has an impact on wildlife, and because wildlife don't adhere to administrative boundaries. There are no clear buffer zones for protected areas in Sri Lanka. While we talk about a buffer zone, the FFPO doesn't actually talk about buffer zones. It just says that development within a 1 mile radius needs an environmental assessment and DWC clearance. So I think legitimizing the buffer zones under the FFPO with strict regulations on the type of development that is permitted will certainly help conservation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pilipitia. You were talking about how we're not focusing on conservation enough. And the thing is, we have tons and tons of management plans for all of these areas, but the problem is we are not implementing them. And there's always room for improvement, I suppose. Going to Jem, so we talked a little bit about how we cannot carry out business as usual. So let's talk about how investing in the environment can feed back the benefits to the community and for economic development, so that the investments that are made, the sustainable investments, can actually result in long-term benefits for the environment, for the society, and for the economy.
Yeah. Thanks, Shatu. I think it's important to. The first step is looking at the investments is one thing, and to me that's more downstream, or it's down further on the chain. The first thing that needs to happen, I think, is and this is part of the work that we do on a global basis within WWF, is to look at how we can shift the financial system to be more sustainable or more green or more environmentally friendly. That begins at the very top. I mean, and it starts at the bottom with the public, but then it starts with who they elect or who is put into office, whether it's an elected government setup or non-elected. The public still has to be thinking in this way, and the governments will respond to how the public thinks. So education of the public is highly important. The next level, though, is at the regulatory level, even legislation, but regulatory level as well, is a bit more where we're looking at most of the times, less so on legislation, but in the finance world. So where things need to begin is at the central bank level, and looking at how they can work to make the system more green. So what has to happen, though, in the beginning, though, to even get this started is the economic model needs to be changed. So, for example, you can't, the idea of operating in a infinite way in a finite world or a finite planet with finite resources, the model currently that we use to measure growth at all costs, without any accountability to externalities or any accountability to the planet, has to stop. That cannot continue because we're actually not accounting for biodiversity loss, the loss to, and all that actually equates to economic loss to the whole system and to companies, and none of that's being accounted for. So we have to look at that, and that has to be measured and brought into the whole way we value not only governments, the way we value companies, the way we look at everything. And that has to all be brought in right from the beginning. So, but what could be done at the, you know, as you go down further, so we start to make those shifts, and we're getting the banks, the central banks listening, we're getting the regulators listening, and they're all starting to work towards this, more so in Europe than anywhere else. They seem to be much more progressive on this than the United States, than Asia. Europe seems to be leading this, and that's kind of where we have to get everyone, all governments. But, you know, just for example, I mean, one thing, you know, we can be doing is to, you know, governments need to accelerate sustainable finance policies to shift, as I mentioned earlier, to shift financial flows from brown to green. Now more than ever, it's essential that public and private investors are able to distinguish between sustainable and non-sustainable investments. And in order to provide greater clarity and transparency, governments need to develop and implement both green and brown taxonomies, if you will, which would enable financial institutions to identify their risk exposure. And then also standardized corporate sustainability disclosures should be introduced to ensure comparability between peer companies. In addition, also large corporations and financial institutions should be required to set sustainability strategies and targets in line with either whether it's the Paris Agreement or in line with other measures that we come up with to look at companies being sustainable. So we've always well, I say historically, it doesn't go back that far, but we have recently, in the recent history, have used climate and the Paris Agreement as a measure, but we need to also start measuring how corporates and businesses and financial institutions, how other environmental issues such as biodiversity loss, ecological breakdown, how that matters and how that measures into a company. So that's the next thing we need to do. So I think, you know, and lastly, I think, you know, we need to develop more financial products that are geared towards bringing more financial flows into conservation or into efforts for environmental protection and also societies, because to me, or to us, it's all one. I mean, you can't just start working on environmental issues and just not, you know, ignore the society. So we need to bring all that in, and how does that work? So we need to create more products or have more products that necessarily maybe not create specific products, but have products that take this into account every single time products are developed. So if you're looking, so for example, a green bond, which I think everyone has heard of, eventually that should no longer be called a green bond or a blue bond. They should just be bonds. And that's how bonds are done. And that's how products are done on a financial level with all these measures into account in the first place. But for now, we're still specifying these and we're putting them in particular buckets as green and blue and sustainable. But eventually that will be all mainstream and everything's going to go that way. But we got to continue to do that. And I think those type of things will drive more investments into sustainability, into the environment, into society. Back over to you, Shatu.
Thanks, Jam. Yeah, that's good to hear that there is like a way forward, and like we just need to shift our focus towards financial growth that's focused on preserving environmental integrity, which will always benefit the community at the end. And we're moving back to Professor Pires. So a little bit about zoonotic diseases. And this is an interesting question that came from the EFL team. So I don't know whether it's directly related to environment per se, but it's related to how we compare COVID-19 to previous zoonotic diseases like SARS. Why was it that we were able to contain SARS, but not COVID. Professor Pires?
Yes, so I think we were very lucky in the case of SARS because of a particular behavior of that particular disease. So in the case of SARS, when a patient was infected, he or she was not very transmissible in the first 4 or 5 days of the infection because the virus seemed to go deep into the lung. It was only after day 5, day 6, after the onset of disease that patients were transmitting to other people. Now, in the case of COVID-19, it behaves much more like, say, influenza, where people are transmitting even before they get symptoms and soon after they get symptoms. So what this means is that, I mean, how we were able to control SARS, even without a vaccine or even at that time without any definite antiviral therapies, was once we had diagnostics, because patients were not transmitting in that first few days window, if you can get patients detected, diagnosed, and into hospital, you can break that chain of transmission. And really, that is what brought that outbreak globally to a halt. But with COVID, and I think we realized this quite early on in January and by early February, and we reported on that as well from Hong Kong, that it was behaving much more like influenza, and there was no hope of controlling it in the same way that we controlled SARS. So I think this is the reason why controlling this outbreak has been so difficult. Now, of course, I mean, if you go back to the 2009 influenza pandemic, what is sometimes called the swine flu pandemic, that also was, spread very much in the same way. But luckily, it was quite mild. So I think, if you go back over these past episodes of emerging infectious diseases, whether it be bird flu or SARS or the 2009 pandemic or Ebola or whatever, each time these emerged and hit the headlines and people were concerned and there was even some global mobilization. But luckily, for different reasons, it was able to be contained, or like 2009 pandemic, it was mild. But it was obvious, I think, to most of us that you can dodge the bullet a couple of times, but sooner or later, you are going to get a bullet that hits you. And sadly, that is what happened in the case of COVID-19. And that is what we are suffering globally in terms of human health, but also in terms of economic health. And I think it comes back to this whole way that we look at our environment, our relationship to the environment, and how we deal with it. And by the way, and I might think, something like COVID-19 is so obvious, and you can't afford to you can't afford to ignore it. But we do have other train wrecks that we are heading towards, and I think climate change being one of the most obvious, the ecological degradation being another one. Now, those are not so dramatic in when they hit us, but I think the final outcomes will be at least as dramatic. And I think this comes back to why we have to use this as an opportunity to change our whole economic model and societal way of thinking about things. Over.
Thanks, Professor Pires. Along the same lines, I know we spoke a little bit about how environmental factors actually affect these infectious diseases. I want to ask you directly whether there's an impact of, say, climate change, for example, increases in temperature or weather patterns also have an influence on how these infectious organisms evolve and spread.
Yeah, so climate change definitely is going forward, is really going to have a major impact on the patterns of infectious disease, particularly things such as those that are spread by mosquito-borne infections, etc. However, up to now, I mean, climate change per se has not had the dominant impact on zoonotic infections or these emerging infectious diseases. It is more these other environmental encroachments that we talked about that have played a role. Over.
Thank you, Professor Pires. As you said that climate change impacts will have an impact on these diseases in the long term, but not right now. There's no obvious influence. So along the same lines, it makes sense right now because climate change or other environmental issues are not treated with the same urgency as COVID-19. And it makes sense for now because COVID-19 is today and the impacts are immediate. But the thing is, tomorrows come faster than we think, and you know what we do today matters tomorrow. So, Dr. Vikram Naik, why do you think that we also have to address climate change and other related environmental issues also with the same urgency?
Okay, so even though, as Professor Pires pointed out, that climate change, it's here, right? But even though it's not making itself, it's not being manifested in terms of pandemics and disease outbreaks, there is the potential to do that. I mean, there is certainly wide agreement among the scientific community that climate change will have serious consequences for human health, placing people, jeopardizing their livelihood, they're placing them in very hazardous and debilitating conditions that compromise their health. I mean, let's look at a few possible scenarios. Warming temperatures and changing weather patterns can cause range shifts in pathogens and vectors that carry them, making whole new communities of people vulnerable to these new diseases or diseases that are new to them. For instance, we're already seeing malaria spreading to high elevations, for instance, from where it was absent before because the vectors were not there before. And harsher environmental conditions can make people more debilitated and compromise their immune systems, making them more vulnerable to the pathogens and to sicknesses, especially as people have less food to eat and become undernourished as weather patterns change and crops keep failing and conditions become more extreme. People will have to move and migrate along in the landscapes to find other places to live. And we're actually already seeing such climate refugees packed into really horrific living conditions, some even trapped in areas of conflict, which is also a manifestation of eventual manifestation of climate change and competition for resources. And under those conditions, diseases could spread, escalating to epidemic levels. And in Sri Lanka, we're already seeing some of these changes. The monsoons that used to be so predictable are no longer predictable. Extreme weather events are creating floods and droughts and causing shortages of food and water, and people are losing lives and livelihoods. They're being displaced and having to seek refuge, place them in very difficult conditions where they become vulnerable to disease. For instance, every time it rains now, we see outbreaks of dengue and other diseases that reach epidemic proportions. So we need to reset our parameters and strive for something better going to the next normal. We need strategies that will prevent health issues from emerging and spreading and ensure our well-being. And many of these solutions that we seek and adopt are in nature conservation. So we have to rebuild with nature for both nature and for us. That includes mitigating climate change going forward. Over.
Thanks, Dr. Vikram Naik. That was informative. And moving on to the development side of things, as Dr. Philippides said, we have this amazing biodiversity. We are one of the global biodiversity hotspots, but we as Sri Lankans just tend to always exploit what we have. And there's so much potential for high-end wildlife tourism in Sri Lanka, which we're really not tapping this potential right now. And I'm worried that once the country opens up, it's going to go back to the old times. Dr. Philippides, how can we actually use this for our benefit while conserving the rich biodiversity we have?
Well, that is going to be a challenge. And to be very honest, I feel that we will miss the opportunity there. Because we all know that Sri Lanka has the potential to be one of the best tourism destinations. And Eric will remember, I think about 15 years ago, he and I were involved in a trying to lobby the government to try to improve the quality of wildlife tourism in Sri Lanka, but it went nowhere. So we have a long way to go before we can achieve that potential. See, because as a country, we seem to be targeting large numbers of tourists. Now you see numbers like 2.5 million tourists by 2022 or 5 million tourists by 2030 being thrown around. But the question is, do we want to attract such numbers to national parks? It's utterly ridiculous if we are trying to do that. So the answer should be absolutely not. Our target should not be, in the wildlife sector, the target should not be the number of visitors. It should be revenue targets. I don't think it would make any difference to the government whether we go for high-end tourism with high revenue targets and limit the numbers, as long as the government gets the revenue that they want. So that's what we really should try to aim for, and try to give tourists a high-quality wildlife viewing experience. But unfortunately, we don't start with a clean slate. We have overcrowded national parks, indisciplined jeep drivers, and visitors get a very poor nature interpretation experience. So how do we turn this around? Actually, the problem, I don't think, is that severe, because we have only 6 national parks that are overcrowded. Yala, Udawalawe, Minneria, Kaudulla, Horton Plains, and Wilpattu is just joining that group. Other than that, the other parks are not overcrowded. So solving the problems in these parks that is overcrowded is a bit complex, and I will address it later. Let me first go for the low-hanging fruit first, which is the other national parks. See, none of these national parks are overcrowded. So if you start imposing visitor limits to these parks now, there will be no political interference in that, because there is no political or livelihood issues like putting jeep drivers out of employment in overcrowded parks. So there will be no political or social issues, no drivers or hospitality service industry personnel who will be out of employment. So immediately, I think very strict limits on entry should be imposed on all the other national parks that are not overcrowded now. That will automatically bring in a restriction to the number of hotels and guest houses being constructed around. Because if the people can't go into the parks, people are not going to invest in guest houses. So these parks can be controlled quite easily, and that's what I think we should do immediately after post-COVID, because that gives us an opportunity to start doing things like this. The other parks, the overcrowded parks, need a different approach, because it has park-specific issues which are different in each location. And the government consensus is that, for example, when we were trying to deal with the overcrowding of Yala, the government consensus is that overcrowding of Yala has to be controlled without the loss of employment to safari jeep drivers, because that will become a political problem. Post-COVID, that is going to be even more important, because the jeep drivers are going to lobby the government, saying that they're losing employment. So specific plans have to be developed for each park. There is a specific plan developed for Yala, which we did in 2016. Unfortunately, it has never been implemented. So as Chaturangi said, it's not the lack of plans, but the lack of implementation of plans. So pressure needs to be put on to government to implement plans. I think the Department of Wildlife Conservation had a wonderful opportunity over these last 2.5 months to come up with plans for visitation in parks, which I suggested to them, but nothing has happened. And I think the DWC should move away from the role of service provider for tourism and to play the role of regulator. Because for one thing, like I said earlier, they're short of staff. So when they're short of staff, they shouldn't be trying to get involved in providing service. And we should try to look at getting community members trained as nature guides to accompany visitors. So if individual plans are prepared for these parks, and we try to control the parks that are not overcrowded now so that it won't get into that state, I think we can have a new dimension to wildlife tourism in Sri Lanka in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Pilipitiya. my personal opinion is also that some parks should be co-managed, where the community can also get involved with proper training and capacity building. So hopefully that's something that DWC will consider in the future. James, coming back to you. So what are some of the financial models that countries like Sri Lanka can adopt? So the debt moratorium mechanisms that can be used to leverage environmental safeguards, is this something that will have an impact on countries that are focused on heavy infrastructure development?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is, you know, back to what I was saying earlier in my first, under my first question is, you know, one of the points that we had mentioned is to limit health crises by acting globally against climate change and biodiversity loss. So the first thing is climate change and biodiversity loss are increasingly exacerbating the spread of infectious disease, according to the WHO. And these effects can only be limited by acting globally. But things like, you know, Sri Lanka can do, also do it on acting locally. So next steps should be to conserve nature that will build resilience and also reduce the contribution to climate change through mitigation and through other measures such as like blue and green sector carbon sequestration, for example. There also must be, you know, an adoption of ambitious and legally binding targets and commitments to address the loss, and, you know, which is alarming loss of nature. So I think those are the first things that you have to look at. But also, I think what needs to happen in order to, I'm going to talk more about on, because for me, it's more about how do you catalyze the capital. So if you look at the way conservation, for example, has historically been done, it's really on relying on grant money from either foundations or from governments or from development banks. What needs to happen, though, is we need to mobilize private sector capital. And in order to do that, we have to start looking at innovative ways to get the private sector involved. Because if you look at, here's the issue. If you look at, for example, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals put out by the UN, they estimate in order to achieve those targets that every year we need 4.5 trillion US dollars to just achieve or hit the targets that we put out on an annual basis. Right now, conservation-led or sustainably led money or funding that goes into environmentally sound projects or issues is only 1.7 trillion. So every year we run a deficit of 2.5 trillion US dollars. So that's cumulative. And so how are we going to make up that difference? So what happens is we need to mobilize private capital, because if you look at the world of private capital, it's absolutely massive. I mean, you're talking, you know, bond markets, you know, just private sector, for example, debt issuance of 92 trillion. Then you look at global equity markets, we're talking 70-something trillion. And the same goes if you look at public debt. Government issued debt, sovereign bonds, municipal bonds. We're talking like around 30, 40 trillion US dollars. So in light of all that, if you look at the 1.7 trillion that's going into conservation or into environmental efforts currently, that's a good number. I mean, 1.5 trillion is nothing, but when you compare it to the overall amount of money or amount of funds that are out there and where the capital flows are going, it's a drop in the bucket. It's nothing. So what we need to do is capture that. So we are working on different ways to do that. And one is to make conservation profitable. So how do you make conservation profitable? Well, the first thing is you need to work on conservation projects that have a commercial return, but also have a conservation impact. So, but the next thing to do is, in order to mobilize the private sector, beyond just profitability, you have to have scalability. So you have to start looking at projects in issues that have potential not only to be profitable, but also have conservation impact, but also be able to scale at a size where you can start getting meaningful investment from the private sector. That's absolutely very important. But on a good note, if we can fix that or solve that area, what we call blended finance is basically getting the public and private sectors together to finance conservation. We can have tremendous impact on what we're trying to do. So I think for me, that is the, that is where we need to go. And that is I think the direction that conservation needs to be led, and also any other type, environmental issues that we're talking about. So yeah, back over to you, Shatu.
Thanks, James. That was really interesting. So we really do have a long way to go in terms of, directing the financial flows towards conservation. And I think this is also where there's a big role in quantifying, in being able to quantify some of these ecosystem services and goods that are provided by nature. So as a developing country like Sri Lanka is really haven't looked a lot at payment for ecosystem services, but it's something that I personally feel like we need to focus on if we are to get the attention of the private sector. I think Dr. Vikramanayaka could also add in later on. Manuri, I missed out on you during the other round, but wanted to talk a little bit about community awareness on illegal wildlife trading, because some of these species that are traded are actually protected and can also be carriers for these pathogens. And how important is that people are aware of this?
Sorry. I'm trying to share a screen, but if it doesn't work, I'll just keep going on it. So, there's awareness and awareness. We seem to think that people meeting these species are somehow forest dwellers, or what we derogatorily call them Vadas, but they're not. There's a general lack of knowledge on zoonotic diseases and any kind of correlation or relationship with animals. So we really have misidentified the communities. That's key. So we seem to be stuck on quite a few labels saying it's always them, but actually it's us. And going back to what Professor Piris mentioned, is rabies is the only zoonotic disease that anyone would identify with. And Sri Lanka has had a sort of a rabies ordinance since independence almost, or pre-independence. And as of yet, we still don't have a plan to combat rabies, for example, even though sort of vaccines and all that's prevalent. So that level of knowledge exists in the general public. So if we are to combat wildlife trade and crime and correlate that to any kind of spread of new disease, we would have to start education at that level. But thankfully in Sri Lanka, I don't think it's quite that bad, but we really don't know as we move further into wilderness spaces. And also, as Eric mentioned, the wilderness spaces and the wildlife are coming to us. So that's something also we don't consider, is that it's not a matter of people actually going to wildlife places or where animals are, but they come to us in terms of, the urban wildlife and species like rats and porcupines or what have you, do find this edge where they actually do very well in these sort of man-modified habitats. So people generally have siloed the kinds of information we have out there to, people eating strange animals, exotic animals, animals that are found sort of far away by sort of communities that are tribal or marginalized. That's not the case. It's actually far more widespread than we think. your average Colombo Wildlife Park goer or pilgrim will partake in some sort of bushmeat. That's a given. It's just sort of common knowledge, but nobody has really quantified it. So if we are to address it, it would have to be through some kind of multidisciplinary platform, not just environment or wildlife conservation. So this would be something like the veterinary sector, the Department of Animal Production and Health. We have the Veterinary Research Institute, the Ministry of Health, for example. Similar to the strategy that they've adopted or tried to adopt for rabies over the many, many years. Thanks, Dr.
Thanks, Manori. Thank you. So we're just going to wrap this up as the speaker session, but we are going to take in some questions. So do send in the questions if you have. You can use Facebook. Also, if you're on Zoom, you can also use the chat box. And to wrap this up, I'm just going to put this question out there for all the speakers. Going forward, how can we prevent spread of these kind of pandemics caused by zoonotic diseases? And we can start with maybe Professor Pires.
Yes, I think one of the most important things in trying to address this issue is to take a holistic approach. So when we talk about pandemics or zoonotic diseases, we are focusing on humans and human health. But as we discussed right now, the factors that lead to this are way beyond hospitals, right? So they involve the animal health sector, the environmental sector, etc. So this concept of One Health, sorry, has now gained a lot of traction. And One Health essentially means that human health, animal health, and environmental health being looked at as one whole continuum, because you cannot have one without the other two. Indeed, my own sort of education in this area came when I was in Sri Lanka back in the 1980s, when we were confronted with a Japanese encephalitis outbreak in 1985 in the north central province, Anuradhapura. And in trying to combat that, of course, we had to work with the hospital sector, but the virus was really coming from a complex set of mosquito, pig, bird interactions. So, so we have to look at this in this multidimensional way. So if you just take an example, again, coming back to the COVID situation, I mean, and you go back to SARS that preceded in 2003, during that investigation, it became clear that the source of the virus jumping to humans was these game animal markets where wild game is sold for human consumption, because that is part of the cultural tradition in southern China anyway. And what may not be appreciated is that after that outbreak in humans was brought under control, the virus was still persisting in these game animal markets. But by identifying that, initially, when we told the authorities in Guangdong about this, they didn't believe it. They didn't, because again, it's a financially quite lucrative venture. But then at the end of 2003, December 2003, there were a few more cases in Guangdong. And there we could very clearly link those cases to the virus in these game animal markets. So then they closed it and they banned that trade. However, unfortunately, as we discussed, before, regulations and bans and whatnot is one thing, but what actually happens is something else. So this trade did continue sort of illegally by and large in many places. And sadly, that is what led to this COVID-19 resurgence. Now, if that lesson had been taken and effectively implemented, I don't think we would be having this particular problem. So it's basically, we didn't learn the lessons from the last time, and we have been punished very badly for it. But I think I would just want to emphasize really this issue of the One Health approach, where we look at things in a holistic manner. Over.
Thank you, Professor Pires. Yes, that's, we do need an integrated approach if we are to battle these. I would like to hear from the other speakers as well, what their thoughts on going forward.
Chatu, you're on mute.
Yeah, just wanted to hear your thoughts as well on how we can combat some of these diseases and also find solutions to prevailing environmental issues.
Okay, so I think we need to get more serious about climate change and not treat it as just mere hand waving. The IPCC's fifth assessment report, for instance, states that health of human populations is going to be affected by shifts in weather patterns and other aspects of climate change. And there was just a study published just a couple of weeks ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that predicts that by 2070, that's only 50 years from now, in the lifespan of most of you, in your lifetime, about 3 billion people, and that's just a little less than half the current global population, will be living in places with extreme temperatures that exceed our upper thermal niche if we don't take action to mitigate climate change now. Most of the land will be experiencing extreme environmental conditions that cannot support these people, cannot support crops, livestock, or the ecosystem services that all of these people depend on. So these people will either have to migrate to other places or try to make it as best they could in these places. And most of the places support fairly, the poorest people on earth. We're talking about most of tropical Asia, most of tropical Africa, South America, parts of Northern Australia. Now, just imagine the consequences as about half the world's population begins to redistribute itself, and the people, most of them desperate, begin to move around. They will move around searching for food, for water, for shelter, and livelihood opportunities. It's going to result in conflict and chaos. And most will certainly die. And the natural landscape that's necessary to provide the basic ecosystem services and the food and the water will be converted in ad hoc and opportunistic ways by desperate people that will exacerbate the lack of water and opportunities for food production. So this is going to create the perfect storm for epidemics and pandemics to rage across the world as starving and debilitated people crowd and scrub around trying to fight for food and water. Now, this is actually not a fantasy scenario. It's already beginning to manifest itself now. It's happening in some parts of the world. And there are papers that relate what's happening in the Middle East, for instance, the migrations from the Middle East into parts of the Western world to climate change. So we have to take actions now and to mitigate and to build resilience and reduce these vulnerabilities. And as I said before, and as JM also alluded to, many of the solutions to climate mitigation, to adaptation and resilience building is in nature conservation, is in green investment. So we need to take a real hard look at the impacts of climate change going forward and build it into our way of life, into our economies, into how we treat nature going forward. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Eric. Very well agreed that we have to act now, or otherwise I think we're already a little too late, but things can be fixed if we act right away. And also we've got a question from the audience, from our viewers, and I think this is a perfect question for Dr. Pilapitia. I'm going to read it as it is because it makes sense and it really comes down to sometimes the political will. It says, how do we make the top level government people, the president and the policymakers and the decision makers, understand the importance of conservation? Many organizations and individuals have tried for years without much success. What can we do differently to achieve that? Can the public help in any way?
Well, that has always been the challenge that we have been faced with. See, I feel that the approach that we have taken with conservation organizations trying to convince the government that conservation is important is suboptimal. It has not worked very well. We have to, it should be an issue that the general public wants, because the politicians are responsible only to the general public because they are voters. So if we can build support for conservation within the general public, then there are opportunities for us to promote conservation at the highest policy levels. And to be able to get the general public support, particularly the general public that lives around protected areas, they have to be getting some benefit from protected area conservation. At this very point in Sri Lanka, the local communities get almost nothing from conservation. The jeep drivers, I think, might be the only local group that is getting some benefit from the protected area network. So we have to try to see whether there are ways of the communities benefiting from conservation. Now, for example, Eric would know this better than me. In Nepal, there is a thing called the buffer zone fund that has been established, where a certain percentage of the revenue from the protected area goes into that fund, and that fund is for development of the local community in the buffer zone communities. When that happens, the buffer zone communities start supporting conservation, and they will put pressure on their local politicians about the importance to conserve. So I think we have to start taking approaches like that. And I also think that the COVID situation gives us a faster way of convincing the politician about the importance of conservation, because while this zoonotic disease, COVID-19, originated in China, there's always a possibility that a zoonotic disease can originate in Sri Lanka. And the more we the more we start encroaching into complex ecosystem, sensitive ecosystems for our development work, the more we start fragmenting ecosystems, we are going to come into more and more contact with wild species. Coming into contact with wild species and then bushmeat, the bushmeat market exposes Sri Lankans also to possible zoonotic diseases. The more you start opening out areas, species like bats and rodents who are in the forests tend to come into urbanized areas and could come into contact with humans, not through eating them, but through other means. They can come into contact with humans and transmit diseases. So we should try to use examples like this to try to convince the politicians and the high-level decision makers that conservation of our ecosystems is absolutely necessary. I think things like that might be the way to go in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pilapitia. I think we have a question for Professor Piris, where a viewer has asked that they've heard that pandemics in the scale of COVID-19 happen only once in a century. As we encroach further into wildlife habitat, is it possible that the occurrence of such pandemics could increase?
Yes, I mean, I suppose the last pandemic of this scale, I mean, of course, we have had pandemics, say, of influenza in 1957, 68, and 2009, etc. But in terms of real human impact and panic, you know, they didn't have the same impact. So we had to go back to 1918, the so-called Spanish flu, which again had, you know, this type of impact. But I think, you know, we really cannot predict when the next occurrence of this scale would arise. I mean, you can predict that another emerging infectious disease of zoonotic origin is going to emerge somewhere across the world in the next 2 or 3 years, because you have to just go back to the last 10 or 15 years, right? You go back Zika, Ebola, the swine flu. So every 2 or 3 years, we have been having these issues, which we have had to deal with, and some of them had quite significant economic impact, but nothing of the scale that we are facing now. So I don't think that we can necessarily be complacent, because as I pointed out, these are happening because of changes we humans have brought about. And these episodes are increasing in frequency, and how severe and controllable or uncontrollable they may be is very difficult to predict. And like I mentioned, I mean, you know, it appeared that we dodged the bullet many times, and we caught the bullet this time. We don't know whether the next episode will be another bullet or not. So I think that there's really no time for complacency. But again, I think we have to broaden this issue beyond just a question of epidemics and pandemics, because I think the bigger issue is this whole sustainability of the ecosystem that we humans are encroaching upon. And I think just to come back to a broader point, I mean, around this webinar and around this table, we are talking sense, I'm sure. But the problem is, how do you convince the general population? I think the point was made that we really have to convince the policymakers and the population. And to some extent, yes, we have to educate the population overall, but the other major group, I think, who can impact on this is the financial community. So I'm really glad that Jean-Marc is a banker originally, and he brings that approach. But I mean, when you think about it, the current economic model, I'm not an economist, I hasten to add, but the current economic model where we think that every year we need to have 3, 4, 5, 6% GDP growth is completely crazy, right? I mean, why do we have to do that? I mean, we need to redistribute wealth is one thing, but it is not sustainable to have this model of perpetual increasing of the so-called GDP without costing the impact that these developments are having on the environment and the ecosystems and the total sustainability of our existence. And I think, as I think was pointed out, you know, we really have to find a way of costing what we do when we talk about economic development. And that is, I think, ultimately the only way that we can bring the attention that is required to try to tackle this. Over.
Thank you, Professor Pires. JM, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, that was said perfectly. I mean, it's, I guess to add on to that, I mean, yeah, I can only reiterate those points. I mean, those are the points I make. And I think, yeah, again, it starts with education of the general populace. But I think, you know, as you know, maybe the conservation community has, you know, in the last 15 years or so really discovered that it's money that drives everything. And the current system is just, it's rigged. I mean, at the end of the day, and it's not that anyone did it. It's just that that's how it has grown from, you know, if we look at the way capitalism has grown in the last probably 150 years or so, it's just, this is what's happened. And, you know, that's just how we did it. But that all has to change if we're going to survive, because, you know, I'm pretty bleak on the outlook of humanity on this planet. So it doesn't look good, you know, 2021, you know, 100, I'm not seeing it. So unless we have drastic change now, and the only way though that we're going to spur that on is by not looking at conservation and environmental issues in the traditional way that we have as a loss leader, or it's money we're going to be, you know, losing if we do this, and we could be spending money somewhere else. That can't be that way anymore. And in fact, it's not a charitable issue at all. If you look at it, you know, if you start talking about natural capital and, you know, ecosystem services, it clearly, you know, from an indirect standpoint is not a waste or a waste of where you spend money. But then you can also look at it directly, I mean, and how you can actually make this into something that's profitable. But again, going back to the GDP point, I mean, it is an absolutely useless metric, and it should be thrown out. And, you know, there should be there actually has been studies done and work done on this from, I can't remember which universities, but there has been work done on where it's like a GDP plus or GDP with the planet in mind. And it works, and it will work. And that's what we have to start doing. And again, the notion of growth at all costs, and, you know, what was just said, I mean, why does it have to be every year a certain amount of growth? Why is that good? Why are we measuring growth? There should be other things that we're measuring. So that's what I'll add on those points.
Thanks, Jan. Thanks. That was interesting. So we have another question, probably. This is also directed at Dr. Pilapitia about how you mentioned focusing on high impact, low impact, high value tourism, which can bring about the change we require in the tourism sector. But there's a worry that this will mean that a lot of people will be losing their jobs, or that it will result in unemployment. But as I understood it, the focus is to get the community also involved in owning some of the protection of these protected areas. And yeah, so that was a question, and you can also add to it.
Like I said, we have 2 sets of parks. No, we have only 6 parks that are overcrowded. That is where the problems of unemployment and social issues will arise if people go out of employment there. But if we start the high-end tourism in the parks that are not highly visited now, it is not that these parks don't have very good wildlife resources. They certainly do. But it's off the main tourist track, so a lot of people are not going. So I would first take the initiate high-end tourism development in parks like Galloya, Maduroya, maybe places like Baskermo, Kumana, where not too many people are going now, and there are not too many drivers, and you're not putting anybody out of employment. In fact, you will be creating employment in those areas, because the community can play a role in guiding. Because if you're going for high-end tourism, you need very high quality nature interpretation. In a department set up, the government, the wildlife department can't develop that within the department, because staff are transferable after 3 years. And somebody who has been trained in nature interpretation will be transferred at the next transfer round into some beat office somewhere in the middle of nowhere. So when he comes back after 3 years, he has forgotten what he has learned. So it is much better to try to use the local communities to do nature interpretation, because they live in the area and the visitors can hire them as guides. So doing high-end tourism in areas that in protected areas that are not crowded now will not put anybody out of employment. In fact, it will generate employment. The problem is the new parks, the overcrowded parks. The 6 overcrowded parks, you can't immediately go for high-end tourism. That will not happen. Over a long period of time, through specific interventions, you can try to reduce the number of visitors going in, but that cannot be done immediately. So that will take a while. So I'm talking about high-end tourism development in parks that are not overcrowded, which will be revenue generating. And when people see that, they might, and the revenue that the people in high-end areas are going to earn is going to be more than what the jeep driver gets in Yala. That might be an incentive for them to want to have a better system in the overcrowded parks as well. I don't know whether I answered it to the satisfaction of the questioner, but that's all I can add at this point. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Pilapitia. We also have another question along the GDP that Professor Piris and JM talked about. But I think this question, maybe Dr. Vikramanayake can add in, because you have some experience working in Bhutan. Can we adopt the system adopted in Bhutan, where human welfare and happiness are given a priority over GDP?
I'm not sure if you can transition to the Bhutan model, which basically restricts tourism but encourages a certain number of visitors but charge them a fair amount of money. But the attraction in Bhutan, you know, it's mystical to people, and they were able to operate along this model compared to the neighbor Nepal, which basically opened up tourism to everybody. And then there were backpackers going through that eventually resulted in a lot of environmental degradation and harm in Nepal. And also don't forget that Bhutan has a much smaller population, low population density. So we're talking about a smaller population to satisfy as well. I'm not sure if Sri Lanka can adopt the same model, but certainly we can adopt the same model in certain areas in terms of how you develop tourism and generate tourism revenues. In terms of losing jobs and losing revenues that will go to the local people and people who run tourism, there are lots of models across the world that operate very well. I mean, gorilla tourism in Rwanda, for instance, where they have community-run guest houses that charge $1,000 a night, and the money is sort of redistributed amongst the local people. So Sri Lanka itself probably cannot not. It will be very difficult to transition to a Bhutan type model, but certainly within Sri Lanka you can have certain attractions that can that can focus on high-end, low impact.
Thanks, Dr. Eric. We are going to take one more question and then we'll probably wrap up. Maybe Professor Pires or Manoli can answer this. Does factory farming directly expose people to pandemic?
Yes, so the intensive animal husbandry that is, being practiced, on the one hand, it is inevitable if you are going to feed the populations, which is continually growing globally, but it has huge risks. I mean, one thing being a monoculture, I mean, whether it be monoculture in terms of plants or animals. I mean, as you may or may not realize, if you look at chicken, the global stock of poultry, particularly chicken that is being raised across the world, is only 3 or 4 genetic stocks, because they have been bred for high performance, whether it be egg laying or meat production. So this means that you have a very homogeneous genetic population, large numbers of it, all in one place. And it means that any infectious disease, particularly a virus, once it adapts, it has a free reign across millions and billions of that species. So that is one part of it. The other part of it is, again, the way that we do things that I mentioned before, that, animals are raised in a very concentrated fashion, but then they are moved to market thousands of miles. And this doesn't take place only in, say, for example, in China. I mean, in the United States, pig production, occurs over multiple states. The sows are in one place, the small pigs are again in another place. They are shifted to a different state because the feed is cheaper there. So you have these large-scale movements of animals in terms of our modern agriculture. And this certainly opens up opportunities for zoonotic infections and pandemic infections. Now, I must say I don't have a complete solution to it, because I can see on the one hand, there is a demand for food production, and on the other, the risks. But having said that, there are still things that you can take to minimize risks. And again, if I come back to the experience in Hong Kong with the avian flu issues, I mean, we were able to show that even though we have these live poultry markets, that is because the population likes to have freshly killed chicken rather than frozen chicken. By making some small changes in the marketing system. So for example, making sure that these live poultry markets are working during the day, but by evening, there is no poultry left and it's empty overnight, it essentially breaks the chain of virus persistence. And that by itself dramatically reduces the risk of zoonotic infections sustaining and transmitting to humans. So I can go on and on about this, but just to make the point that by understanding the drivers of zoonotic emergence in this One Health manner that I talked about, and by working out where you can strategically intervene, you can reduce the risks even within the existing systems. But we do have this two two competing issues. One is the need for food production, and the other is the risks that this generates. Over.
Sorry. I think thank you, Professor Pires. We have a lot of questions on, which is around how we need a systematic change and how we need a change in the governance structure in order for all of this to be actually, whatever we are talking about here, to be realistic. And we agree, we hear you, and I think the conservationists from Sri Lanka can agree that we do need an overhaul in the system. But how to go about it, we're not sure, because I feel like it's up to us in a way, but then the pressure that we need to keep exerting, we just cannot, lose the momentum. And if Dr. Pilapitiya or maybe Manori can also add into this.
Well, the biggest problem in Sri Lanka is the issue of environmental governance. If we in situation, but the problem we have is even the government system doesn't have any accountability. Again, I don't want to get too much into details of political interference, but the governance issue starts from there. If there is no political interference, the government agencies can be held to a much higher standard of governance than if there is interference. So stopping that is a huge challenge. And to stop that, unless at the highest levels of government, there is some commitment to stop interference into the day-to-day running of agencies, it is a very difficult thing. So what we have to do is to keep lobbying at the highest levels, because it has to come from there. Because the departments, the wildlife conservation departments' hands are tied to a certain extent, because when they make certain decisions, it could be overruled. Now, for example, the department proposed to the political leadership that they will introduce e-ticketing to Yala, and after a certain point, after you reach a certain number of tickets, you cut it off. So after that, people can't come in because you can't buy a ticket. But they were told, no, you can introduce e-ticketing, but there can be no cutoff point. And that's coming from the top level. So interference on day-to-day running of protected areas, when this type of thing happens, it becomes extremely difficult to ensure governance. Most of the illegal sand mining, illegal timber felling, poachers are all being protected by local politicians. So that's a challenge that I really don't know how we can deal with. And until we deal with that, this will never ease.
Can I jump in, Sumit?
Yeah.
With just a comment. Yeah. So while it seems that protected areas are on top of the list at the moment, I think we are getting pigeonholed into just remedying issues within national parks, and particularly the tourism-worthy national parks, even the high visitation or low visitation. But fundamentally, we are here today because of issues with environment and environment governance. And I believe that in terms of reaching any kind of sort of political leverage is the most pressing issue that politicians sell in this country is water. You know, be it large irrigation, small irrigation, hydropower, and also drinking water. And if we are, as an environment community, to reach out to the general public in a relatable form of impacts to the environment, I think the handle is water, because in Sri Lanka, water is extremely important, and people don't see the interconnectivity between environment quality and water. And loads of studies leading up to us hitting day zero, as in Colombo or the urban areas. Kalutara, I think, has already, in terms of drinking water. So we really have to figure out ways of relating environment issues to the day-to-day living of the general public. And I think that's the only way that we can leverage environment governance in the larger scale. And I don't think that message is going out there, because sadly, it seems the conservation community is going around in circles trying to fix wildlife tourism, which is just one of the remedies. Thanks, Shadu.
Thanks, Manori. I think we will wrap up this session now. And before we do that, I would like to thank all of the speakers for devoting some time coming here and explaining to us, sharing your knowledge and experience. And it was a bittersweet discussion, to be honest. It's completely daunting, but chats with, especially with what James has said and Professor Beers have said, there is hope moving forward, and because we do have ways and means of avoiding some of these impending calamities. And now it's clear more than ever that that disease spread and emergence of zoonosis are largely a product of human activity. So the solution to these problems must also be a matter of human choice. So all we need is a political will, and the time to act is now. On that note, we're going to wrap this session up, and thank you for all those joined in and the ones who sent in the questions. And we hope to see you again during a different session of great conversation. Thank you.